Hello. For months, the map barely moved. The front lines looked frozen. Analysts talked about stalemate. Critics in Washington asked whether billions of American dollars were simply sustaining a war with no visible progress. And then movement. Over the past weeks, Ukrainian forces have pushed forward. Settlements retaken. Defensive lines pressured. Hundreds of square kilometers reclaimed, according to open-source battlefield assessments. Not a collapse, but momentum. And in war, momentum changes psychology. But here is the uncomfortable question for the United States. Is this the beginning of a real turning point? Or is it the calm before a more dangerous escalation? Because this is no longer just Ukraine's war. It is a test of American strategy. For over 2 years, Washington has invested tens of billions of dollars in military and economic assistance, advanced weapons systems, intelligence sharing, training programs, financial support to keep the Ukrainian state functioning. Supporters argue this is about defending international order. Critics argue this is an open-ended commitment with unclear limits. Now, for the first time in a while, there is something tangible to point to: progress on the battlefield. But progress is not victory. Let's slow this down and separate emotion from structure. Tactical gains do not equal strategic breakthrough. A true turning point in war looks different. It involves systemic collapse, loss of major logistical hubs, breakdown of command cohesion. That is not what we are seeing. What we are seeing is a shift in tempo. And tempo matters. Ukraine appears to be operating with improved coordination, integrating drones, artillery, intelligence, and maneuver units more effectively. Western-supplied systems are being used with increasing precision. Attrition may be creating vulnerabilities in Russian defensive lines. But Russia is not collapsing. It retains the ability to conduct long-range strikes. It continues to mobilize resources. It maintains layered defenses and strategic depth. So what does this moment actually represent? There are 3 plausible interpretations. The first is cumulative pressure finally producing visible results. Sustained Western support combined with Russian attrition could be opening windows for Ukraine to exploit. If this momentum becomes durable, measured in months, not weeks, it could gradually shift the strategic balance. For Washington, that would be a powerful validation. It would strengthen the argument that American assistance is not symbolic. It is consequential. It would reinforce U.S. credibility within NATO. It would send a message to Beijing that long-term Western coalitions can endure and produce results. But there is a second possibility, and it is more unsettling. History teaches us that local withdrawals sometimes precede force concentration elsewhere. A temporary loss of ground can be part of a broader recalibration. If Moscow is redistributing forces, consolidating reserves, or preparing for a more focused offensive, today's gains could precede tomorrow's escalation. And escalation carries risk, not only for Ukraine, but for the United States. Because deeper escalation means higher financial costs, more advanced weapons systems, increased strategic exposure, greater pressure inside Congress, greater polarization at home. And then there's a third scenario, one that often emerges quietly: negotiations. Wars do not always end with decisive collapse. They often transition into political phases when neither side sees a clear path to total victory. In such moments, battlefield gains become bargaining chips. If Ukrainian momentum strengthens Kyiv's position, it may also strengthen its leverage in eventual talks. But negotiations raise difficult questions for Washington. What terms would be acceptable? Would Europe align? Would a negotiated settlement freeze instability or reduce it? And what message would it send to adversaries about American endurance? Overlay all of this with the economic dimension. Russia's economy is under strain. Growth has slowed. Military expenditures consume an expanding share of the state budget. Sanctions have restructured trade flows. But economic stress does not automatically translate into military collapse. States at war often reallocate aggressively toward defense. Civilian sectors absorb the pain while the war machine continues to operate. The real question is sustainability. How long can Russia absorb pressure? How long can the United States maintain bipartisan support? How long can European unity hold? Because wars of attrition are not decided in weeks. They are decided by endurance. And endurance is political. American voters are watching inflation, energy prices, border debates, domestic priorities. Ukraine competes with other crises in the Middle East, in the Pacific, at home. This is why this moment feels larger than the map suggests. If Ukrainian advances consolidate and expand, Washington's strategy gains legitimacy. If momentum stalls or reverses, pressure inside the U.S. political system will intensify. And then there is China. Beijing is watching carefully. The durability of American commitments in Ukraine shapes calculations in the Indo-Pacific. If the United States demonstrates sustained strategic patience, it strengthens deterrence globally. If it signals fatigue, it reshapes the global balance. That is why this battlefield shift matters beyond Eastern Europe. At this point, three trajectories remain possible. 1. Ukrainian momentum becomes sustainable and gradually alters the balance of power. 2. Russia escalates, concentrates forces, and attempts to reclaim initiative, increasing the risk profile for all parties. 3. Military movement stabilizes, and the conflict transitions into a political negotiation phase shaped by relative equilibrium. None of these outcomes is predetermined. What is clear is that this is not merely about territory. It is about whether American strategy is entering a phase of validation or approaching its limits. Long wars test not only armies, but societies. They test budgets, alliances, patience, political cohesion. And this phase of the war may prove to be one of those inflection points where miscalculation becomes decisive. Because wars rarely end when one side becomes invincible. They end when one side misjudges its capacity to continue. Right now, the map is moving. But the deeper question for America is not how far Ukrainian forces have advanced. It is whether the United States can sustain the strategic weight of this conflict, and whether this moment marks the beginning of a shift in the war or the beginning of a more dangerous chapter. The battlefield may be in Eastern Europe, but the strategic consequences reach Washington. And that is why this moment matters.